Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries, taking a look at some of the, well, in this case, the captured Argentinian guns that they have in their rather extensive reference collection. And what we have here is an Argentine PAM-1, or actually it's marked PAM-1, but it's technically a PAM-2. That PAM stands for Pistola Ametralladora, or automatic pistol, submachine gun, number 1 or number 2. Number 2 is the upgrade with a grip safety. So a little bit of backstory on this. In 1936, the Argentine FMAP factory, or Fábrica Militar de Armas Portátiles, opened in Buenos Aires, and they initially were set up to produce a licensed copy of the Colt 1911. That would become known as the Sistema Colt, or the Model 1927, in Argentine service. They built those for a number of years. Ultimately, in 1942, the factory moves from Buenos Aires to Rosario and continues production of military arms. And it's unclear to me if this project was something they reverse engineered or something they licensed, but I think it was probably reverse engineered. Now, this is obviously a copy of the American M3A1 grease gun, submachine gun, except instead of being in .45 caliber, it's in regular 9x19. The first prototype of this was demonstrated to the Argentine military in October of 1950, and production took another 4 years to get going. So the first guns came off the factory line, first real production examples, in 1954. And it's that timeline that makes me think that this was a reverse engineered project. I feel like if this had been a licensed copy done with technical assistance, it wouldn't have taken 4 years to get this thing into actual production. But I could be wrong on that. I see conflicting sources about whether it was licensed or just copied. Anyway, production begins in 1954 and it will run until 1961. They actually stop in 61 because in 1962 the factory begins production of FAL rifles, so kind of switch priorities there. And at that point, they have basically all of the guns manufactured. There was a total of 34,636 of these manufactured. And all except 1,100 were made by 1961. In 1969, they came back and made one extra batch of 1,100 of them, because I guess they needed a few extra guns. Now, what happens in 63 is the guns have gone into service, they're being used, and they realize that they're not drop safe. So like many open bolt submachine guns, this is, if you want to be safe, you would carry this with the bolt forward. Well, if you drop the gun on its buttstock, say you jump out of the back of a truck that's carrying infantry, and maybe you slip and the buttstock of the gun hits the ground, there is enough inertia in the bolt that it will come backwards against the recoil spring, and then it will come forward, pick up a cartridge, and because it has a fixed firing pin and it's a simple blowback gun, it'll slam that cartridge into the chamber and fire it. Now, it'll only fire once, because once it does that, the bolt will catch on the sear like it's supposed to, unless you actually have the trigger pulled. But that one round can very easily injure or kill someone, and that's a well-known safety issue with submachine guns, but I guess it's something that the Argentines didn't really think about. In 63, they decide, we need to do something to fix this. They change the designation from PAM-1 to PAM-2, and they add that lever right there as a grip safety. So let me show you how that works. There you go. This essentially is an M3A1 grease gun in 9mm Parabellum. So you'll notice we don't have a crank handle on the side, we have the enlarged top cover. This, in theory, functions as the safety, and it does work as a safety. So you have this tab right here that will lock into one of these two holes when the dust cover is closed, and that prevents the bolt from bouncing open and the gun from firing. The problem apparently is that nobody ever leaves it closed, they leave it open, and then you don't have any actual safety. Now, because this is the M3, it doesn't have the charging handle, it has just a thumb hole in the bolt, and that is how you cock the thing. Very sort of late war style. Sure, this was kind of the late war American submachine gun before it got copied. Now, the American version, of course, doesn't have this grip safety, and you can just cock the bolt open. On the Argentine ones, you have to actually be holding the grip safety in order to cock the bolt, or to dry fire it, which makes this a somewhat complicated process. There we go. I have seen some references that suggest that this is like a scaled down 7/8 scale version of the grease gun. That's really actually not true. The receiver is the same size. The magazine is scaled down and the magazine well is scaled down, but overall the gun is the same size, slightly lighter than an American grease gun, comes in at 7.27 pounds. And I think the lack of, the reduction in weight is largely due to things like less barrel, a little less material up here necessary. Now, the magazine for the PAM-1 looks like a grease gun mag. It also looks like a Sten mag. You would think, perhaps, oh, well, you could just use a Sten mag. Well, Argentina didn't use the Sten, so it didn't necessarily make sense for them to use that existing magazine. They just built themselves a scaled-down 9mm Parabellum grease gun mag. So capacity is, I believe, 30 rounds. We do actually have witness holes here, which the US ones do not have. Single feed, double stack single feed magazine. The sights are probably the, aside from caliber, the biggest difference between the US grease gun and the PAM-1. The US had a fixed rear aperture. The Argentines went ahead and put a 2-position rear notch sight on here, 50 meters and 100 meters. And honestly, to me, that is a terrible sight. The sight picture for me is quite awful. The front sight to go along with it is a little barleycorn there. The US had just a stamped tab as a front sight. The Argentines put a little more work into it, same with their rear sight. They have a barleycorn that is actually drift adjustable for zeroing for windage. What the US did, interestingly, for zeroing the rear sight is they had a fixed front sight, they had a fixed rear sight, and they actually set the gun in a jig and essentially used a big machine to line up the bore with a drill bit on the rear sight and drilled the rear sight hole pre-zeroed at the factory. Kind of a cool industrial thing. But anyway, the Argentines have just a notch sight. So that grip safety does its job. You can't pull the bolt back unless the grip safety is depressed. If you fire the gun without the grip safety engaged, the bolt will come halfway, which is not far enough to pick up a cartridge. And at this point, you now can't depress the grip safety because it is an angled connection on the inside. You'll see it in a moment. In order to fix this, you have to recock the bolt, and then you can depress the grip safety. So you don't want someone to fire the gun like this, have it ready to pick up a cartridge, and then grab it unintentionally and have it fire as soon as they grab the grip safety. So the conversion, the design work on this seems to have been done fairly well. That is the engaged position. That is the disengaged position. So when it is engaged, that lever actually hooks inside this front plate on the bolt assembly, and that is why if you drop the bolt onto the lever, you can't just push it down because you have to pull this out so that that can come out from inside the bolt face. To disassemble it, really all we're going to do is pull the barrel off. So pull this tab down to relieve pressure on the ratchet. You generally don't want to just unscrew it against the ratchet, making that zipping noise, because you'll wear down the ratchet teeth. There we go, there's our barrel. This barrel stub here is a little thinner than on the US grease gun. It's actually about half the thickness. We then have the bolt assembly inside. We hold down the grip safety, we can pull that forward, kind of wedge it around the ejector there. There's our internal mechanism. That's it. It's fixed firing pin in the bolt, simple blowback, 2 captive recoil springs. The bolt's going to cycle back and forth like that. That's basically all there is to it. The rest of this is 2 halves welded together, so this doesn't disassemble. You do have space for an oil bottle. It's missing on this example, but sorry, that is an oil bottle. The oiler brush is the part that's missing. So you had a little bit of cleaning capability with you. The stock here, of course, you push in this button and you can extend the stock out. And to take a quick look at the markings, we have PAM-1, caliber 9, FMAP-DGFM, same name, 2 different abbreviations in 2 different languages. Argentine crest. There's our serial number. This one is 30,300, still a PAM-1. I do actually have a second example here that I can show you that is marked PAM-2. Does not appear to be any sort of overstamp. This is 31,200, so I'm assuming this is actually a factory-made PAM-2, not a conversion. I know those numbers don't quite add up to the totals that I gave you, and I don't have a good answer for that. The reference, I've given you the best information that I've been able to put together, which was 34,436 total made. all but 1,100 in pre-62. Starting in 63, the Argentines would begin to convert PAM-1s to the PAM-2 configuration with this grip safety. Now, the only batch of original, like factory production PAM-2s took place in 1969. It was that batch of 1,100 guns I mentioned at the beginning. Other than that, all of the PAM-2s are just converted to PAM-1s. And I believe, if I have the chronology right in my head, you can actually tell the factory-made PAM-2s are the only ones that are actually marked PAM-2. All the others are PAM-1 with the upgrades. So in total, apparently, about 16,500 or so were converted from 1 to 2. Now, the only guns that we typically see outside of Argentina are PAM-2s, I think largely because these guns were still in service in the early 1980s when the Falklands War happened, and the British brought back a bunch of surrendered Argentine firearms, including PAM-2s. By that point, it appears the PAM-1s were not in active frontline service. If they were still in use, if they hadn't been scrapped or destroyed or anything, they were being used, well, back at home in Argentina, and the guns that were with frontline troops were the ones with the grip safeties. So that's what the British captured, that's what they brought back home, that's what's here in the Royal Armories, and that accounts for most of the other guns, at least that I'm aware of. So we don't typically see PAM-1s, we always see PAM-2s, but there was actually about half of them stayed in the PAM-1 configuration. Now, this would ultimately serve in the Argentine military into the 1990s before it was retired. It was replaced by the PA-3, better known as the FMK submachine gun. That actually went into production in the 1970s, and that and this served alongside for 15 or so years. What's kind of interesting to me is when these were essentially surplused, declared obsolete, and taken out of military service and inventory, apparently, most of them were actually sold on the commercial market in Argentina to civilians. They were converted to semi-automatic only and sold to Argentines who had license to purchase semi-auto firearms, which is, it's a thing that governments used to do quite a lot, not so much the conversion, but 100 years ago or so, it was quite common for government surplus arms to just be sold to the general public. But it's rather rare for that to happen these days, and the idea of Argentina doing it in the 1990s is one of the most recent examples that I can think of, I'm aware of, aside from, of course, some of the things like US CMP sales of older guns. Anyway, I've been wanting to get a close look at one of these for a little while. It's a cool conversion. It is the grease gun continuing on its service life well after World War II. There are a couple other countries that used the grease gun that copied it, like China, for example, but this is one of the more interesting ones to me. So big thanks to the Royal Armories for giving me the opportunity to take a look at these two of them, the 1 and the 2, film them for you. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.